When it comes to naming the ultimate cult classic video game, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better candidate than Double Fine Psychonauts, released in 2005. It's a game that sees you playing as psychic circus runaway Rasputin Aquato and invading people's brains, which serve as the game's levels. With the legendary Tim Schafer as director, as well as a team of seasoned LucasArts adventure game veterans developing the game, Psychonauts was set to be, quote, the greatest game of all time ever. Unfortunately, on release, Psychonauts was an abject financial failure, selling fewer than 100,000 copies in North America, as well as causing its publisher to almost go bust. Which, if you've actually played Psychonauts, sorta makes sense. To not put too fine of a point on it, Psychonauts 1 is barely finished, plays like crap, doesn't really know what it wants to be, and the less said about its infamous final level meat circus, the better. TLDR, as a video game, Psychonauts 1 isn't great. However, although I may have just spent the last paragraph insulting it, I think Psychonauts is nothing short of genius. Because in spite of all of its flaws, it absolutely nails a single, central design idea that ties the entire game together and which nothing else has quite managed to pull off as well. Except maybe Psychonauts 2, which, unlike its predecessor, didn't take 5+ years to get the sales and popularity that it so clearly deserved. I believe the thing that sets the Psychonauts series apart isn't necessarily its theme or writing, and it's definitely not its gameplay, but the way it uses its level design not just to tell a story, but to get the player directly involved in the narrative. You may have heard the term environmental storytelling before, because, let's be honest, it's a bit of a buzzword. But it's exactly what I'm talking about here. Gaming stories don't just have to take the form of dialogue, backstory, and narration, it's entirely possible to convey incredible thematic and narrative depth through audiovisual design, the use of gameplay mechanics as metaphors, and even the architecture of a game's levels themselves. Take the early game level Loboto's Labyrinth from the opening of Psychonauts 2, where you and your spy pals have trapped Dr. Loboto, evil dentist and amateur brain surgeon, in a pretend mental office to try and get him to spill his secrets. However, as Loboto begins to resist his interrogation, more and more of his own psyche begins to invade the office setting. In this way, you can literally gauge the balance of power between Team Psychonaut and Dr. Loboto by how much of the level has become dentistry themed versus office themed. Not only that, hints of this already exist before Loboto fully takes over, like these motivational posters reminding him to keep his mouth shut about the evil plan he was a part of. These things are actually all over the place, you just don't notice them until Lily helpfully points them out around the same time as you learn pyrokinesis. Psychonauts even uses enemies to help flesh out the state of mind of whoever's brain you're invading. As Loboto reasserts control over his own mind, only then do sensors start spawning, the part of any healthy brain designed to get rid of both unwanted thoughts as well as unwanted psychonauts. And where you start approaching the part of Dr. Loboto's mind where his secrets are kept, regrets and doubts begin to spawn, hinting at the eventual reveal that he's just as much a victim as the people he experimented on. Well, sort of. Mental health wise, it's a bit simplistic, but all this serves to tie the level's dramatic arc directly to its level design in a way that's immediately tangible for the player, because all this information is conveyed organically through your relationship with the world, and the plot reveals mean that much more because they're enhanced by the endorphin rush of making these connections yourself. This is Psychonauts' greatest strength, and the reason why it's considered a classic to this day. It manages to tell nuanced stories without interrupting the flow of gameplay that the player can get much more emotionally invested in because they discovered the plot themselves. Environmental storytelling makes some very impressive promises, and it's hard not to see why the technique has become more and more widespread as budgets have swelled and gaming worlds have grown bigger and more complex. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all games do it well, or that environmental storytelling is some kind of narrative silver bullet. Far from it. It took me sitting down and blitzing my way through all 3 Psychonauts games to realise that many similar titles don't use their environments to tell stories nearly as well as they could be doing, and I think that one major lapse in narrative design is ultimately to blame. To show you what I mean, let me walk you through 2 different examples of how 2 similar games portray the classic evil fascist regime, and why one of them is vastly more successful. Take a look at this heavily advertised section in Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, where you get taken on a guided tour of what America's like under Nazi occupation. You see KKK people hanging out with Nazis, people being afraid of soldiers, and a bunch of propaganda everywhere. It's a beautifully realised little slice of world building, but that's sort of where it ends. You're shown the good hard-working America that Blazkowicz loves so much twisted by fascism, but always at a distance and always in very simple, kind of obvious terms. Wolfenstein 2 doesn't need to spend this much time telling us Nazis are the bad guys because we ought to know that already. What it fails to do is convey that conflict in a way that makes it personal and to get the player on BJ's emotional level. This is why it sucks that the one direct interaction you have with an actual Nazi in this segment kinda makes him look like an idiot, putting further distance between what BJ Blazkowicz feels and what the player ends up experiencing. In Half-Life 2, on the other hand, the game is able to instantly establish the main threat, get you invested in shooting them, and show what life is like after the 7-hour war in just a few minutes. The moment you step off the train after starting the game, the very first thing you encounter is this massive propaganda screen of Dr. Breen telling everyone not how evil the Combine are, but how cool they are, which is an immediate red flag, juxtaposed with the rest of the setting. All the guards standing around don't just harass random NPCs in scripted interactions, but you too, and this security bot follows you around as well. Even after Barney rescues you and gives you some hope of fighting back, the very next thing you see is this Combine Metrocop who wants you to pick up a can and won't let you pass until you do. This Metrocop is rude, forces you to perform a menial, degrading task to proceed, and if you even think about offering token resistance, you get the shit beaten out of you. Tone immediately established. You want to kill some Combine, freeing the game up to build on this emotional state in more subtle ways as the intro progresses. On a broad plot level, these two sections serve more or less the same purpose, to show you, the player, how everyday society has changed since the bad guys took over, and to get you invested in kicking them out. The difference between them is that Wolfenstein's take is incredibly passive, constantly keeping the player at a distance and never really letting them do any work for themselves, whereas Half-Life's storytelling is much more active, putting the player's subjective experience front and center, but also not being afraid to let them do the work of interpreting the world for themselves. The same can be seen in Psychonauts, with the best example being in the absolutely legendary level, the Milkman Conspiracy. The guys whose head you invade, Boyd, is a paranoid conspiracy theorist who's completely unable to distinguish reality from his own twisted delusions. And I mean literally twisted. The Milkman Conspiracy's level design is comprised of this nightmarish suburban sprawl made of mismatched puzzle pieces that warps and folds back in on itself, and it's filled with eyes, cameras, and surveillance equipment basically everywhere, watching your every move. Simply existing in this space gets you to see the world how Boyd does, impossibly complex and confusing, yet always out to get him. And the deeper you prod, in particular, with the level's signature skill, clairvoyance, the more surprising details you uncover, and the more interesting Boyd as a character becomes, rewarding your curiosity, as well as for putting up with the god-awful platforming and the pointless mini-bosses. I could probably make a whole video about how cool clairvoyance is. It's an ability that lets you find out how other people see you. It's a ridiculously efficient storytelling tool that could basically only work in Psychonauts. It is brilliant. Expecting players to interpret a game's environment and thematics in the correct way can be a bit of a risk though. A lot of players end up missing out on the actually quite good stories of most Souls-likes because it's so hard to actually find, and many crucial plot details are locked away in item descriptions or background details that you wouldn't look twice at. That's why many of the best examples of environmental storytelling aren't found in individual moments, but are spread across entire levels or areas, all of which act as redundancies for one another. Bioshock's best level, Fort Frolic, does this really well. The zone of Fort Frolic is all about mad artist Sander Cohen and your weird relationship as his latest project. To this effect, the game needs to communicate this aspect of Sander's character as well as how you're expected to feel about it in order for the emotional arc of the level to work. As a result, Bioshock's environments communicate this from multiple different directions. There are audio logs where Sander natters on about his various masterworks, he upstages Atlas and Andrew Ryan by redecorating in his own image, there are these spotlights that follow you around the level, the entire place is festooned with the superficial trappings of old Hollywood, and the enemies in Fort Frolic, rather than being difficult, are just another part of Cohen's mad vision, being coated in plastercast and then told to enact weird tableaus before attacking you, or ordered to fight to the tune of classical music. Even if you miss some of these, the vibe and central theme of Fort Frolic still shines through, namely the weird, almost voyeuristic feeling of being watched and toyed with, and the knowledge that Sander Cohen is a man who cares about his art above all else. Being able to gradually piece together and infer all this information from Sander's domain not only adds some much needed extra depth and texture to his fairly boring goon hunts, but it also makes your final confrontation with him much more meaningful, which actually gives you a much stronger connection to the character than if Sander had simply told you he was nuts himself. You'd have to be a real dum-dum who forgot what made the original games good to just have the villain sort of explain his whole deal right to your face. Yep, thank God that didn't happen. Far too often in games, world building and environmental design ends up being more of a background tableau than a living, breathing part of the narrative, and this can lead to environmental stories that feel lifeless and stale and like they don't really add anything to your understanding of the wider narrative they're supposed to be contributing to. Take your average Fallout with magic or Elder Scrolls with guns game, which are littered with environmental narratives baked into the worlds you explore, but they never really feel like they matter. Here's a lady who got shot by an arrow when she was skinny dipping. Over here there's a guy who shot himself trying to get into a bunker, and here's a burnt down house with potions of insulation in the rubble. Each of these little vignettes manage to tell a story using only the environment, and sometimes they're even pretty funny. But they never really teach you anything new about the world, your place in it, or how to feel about the big plot events happening all around you. They're less environmental stories and more environmental anecdotes, something that's made worse by the fact these games love resorting to boring lore dumps at the drop of a hat. To see this sort of stuff done better, you need look no further than Deus Ex Mankind Divided, which uses its open world to great effect to expand upon the game's core themes, that being that your decisions will always have consequences, and that in Prague, augmented people are second-class citizens. For example, if you kill a shopkeeper, later on, the cops will have locked the place down, making traversing the city that much harder if they're on the lookout for you. My favourite bit of the game's environmental storytelling though has to be in the various train stations. See, the place is split up into natural and augmented sides, with the natural side being visibly cleaner than the orc side because nobody likes orcs. Not only that, you as an augmented person will be constantly hassled by the cops for your papers if you choose to go on the orc side, and will get dirty looks and a telling off if you use the natural cars. Mankind Divided manages to tell smaller stories that resolve very quickly, and don't outstay their welcome, but it remembers to always orient them around the game's core ideas, meaning you as a player have the thematic foundation you need to build up a deeply personal understanding of the environment through these mini-stories. Of course, this isn't to say that good environmental storytelling has to constantly get in the player's face, or that it can never exist purely to establish a vibe. By virtue of its core gimmick, Psychonauts will always be getting up close and personal with its characters' emotions, but other games can use environmental storytelling in much more subtle, abstract manners. Journey conveys a complete narrative using no words, no other characters, and basically nothing in the way of complex metaphor by using the topology of its environments to convey an emotional arc. Starting out in the desert, you're free to explore and play around to your heart's content, with the occasional structure dotted around the vast expanse of nothingness. As you progress, things get more and more built up, but also more restricted, until you're eventually forced into this deep, dark tunnel filled with these horrible robo-snakes. From there, the game alternates between open and light to dark and claustrophobic, with the game's lowest points restricting where you can go and what you can do as control is ripped away, and the highest being glorious moments of total freedom. The key is still though that these emotional cues are discovered by the player's action and analysis into the world. Journey doesn't just stop at making things dark and spooky or light and happy, it manifests these emotions in the design of the world. It gives you something to be afraid of and puts a bunch of cloths around that let you fly all over the place to have a bunch of fun. It's also worth mentioning that straightforward exposition is in no way bad. The act of sitting the player down and explaining everything they need to know can be highly effective, and can actually free up designers to do more environmental stuff in other parts of the game. My favourite level in Psychonauts 2 is literally wall-to-wall exposition, and it is absolutely fantastic. But it is also a massive spoiler, so I can't talk about it or its absurdly catchy theme song too much. Even very open, narratively light games, like say Breath of the Wild, make sure to tell the player the core plot in a classic expositional way because it informs and establishes a foundation for everything else later on in the game. Environmental storytelling is a tricky thing to get right. Hell, even Psychonauts screws it up every now and again. For every level like Millard's dance party, which seems outwardly fun, safe and welcoming, but only because Camilla is trying hard to suppress the trauma of children who burn to death on her watch, you get some real stinkers. Cassie's collection is set in a big library because it's about a writer who, presumably enjoys books and has no other personality traits, and Gloria's theatre uses this lighting rig to swap the stage between light and dark modes in the world's most tone-deaf portrayal of bipolar disorder. Even though games are at a brand new frontier of storytelling, using their worlds to communicate with their audiences, the same narrative rules that writers have been following for centuries still apply. Flat, uninteresting scenes with no depth or context will be unable to grab the audience's attention no matter how many art teams get worked to death building them, and by not respecting the audience's intelligence and their capacity to understand what a metaphor is, a game will end up losing their interest. Equally though, in order to help this new kind of storytelling flourish, players need to do better as well. Just as environmental storytelling needs an active component, so too does our role as players. We need to interrogate the environments we find ourselves in, ask questions, and try to find out the answers, with the reward being deeper, more engaging narratives that take place in more fully realised settings. By refusing to put our half of the work in, and not bothering to question and interact with what's on the surface, or by expecting an entire story to be delivered to us on a silver platter, we reward games with lazy writing and punish those developers who really put the work in to design rich and interesting worlds. And there is no better example of the benefits of this kind of dual approach than Psychonauts, a game that should by all rights have failed, but because it stuck to its storytelling principles and allowed players to immerse themselves into its weird mental worlds, eventually it got the credit and the second chance at success it so deserved. But, just between you and me, can games not get rid of boring, really long cutscenes where you can't do anything just yet? Because complaining about them is like half of my job, so let's not do anything rash, okay? Yeah, are we all fine? Yeah, we're good, we're fine, let's just not do it, alright? Hello, what's up? It's the After the Video bit. How are you doing? Silent as per usual? Just the way I like it. In case you weren't aware, these segments are where I like to shout out two very important groups of people that I think all of you viewers should be made aware of, because they're all much cooler and more interesting than I am. The first group is comprised of internet people that I think you should all take a look at, and this time it's Transparency, a video essay channel run by two very clever ladies and focusing on some pretty eclectic topics ranging from ripping apart forgotten 80s Disney movies to the importance of character creators as a means of self-expression. My personal favourite video is their 30-minute defense of the infamous scene in Final Fantasy X where Tidus, the main character, does a silly laugh. In particular, how that out-of-context scene has managed to completely critically overshadow a very good game, and it's well worth a watch. The other group of people I need to shout out are my patrons, who in exchange for just a few dollars a month get all sorts of goodies like early access to videos, secret behind the scenes content, and the warm fuzzy feeling of having paid to sustain independent critical content on YouTube. If you'd like to join them, then just know that supporting on Patreon for 1 month at the lowest tier is worth more than a lifetime of ad views on YouTube. So if you're a patron, you get my eternal blessing to ad block my stuff. It's that simple. And if you're generous enough to donate $10 a month, you even get to be in the end of video shoutout like these fine people, who are Alex Vieira, Andrew Lebrano, Asaran, Alsakav, Bjorn Kala, Brennan Spalling, Brian Notariani, Konstantina Punkt, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjes, David Setzer, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Dotwo, Digletier, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Eugene Bulkin, Evie, Gazkul, Gretar Hannison, Jacob Dylan Riddle, James Andrew Adams, Joey Bruno, Jordan Gear, George Aria Navarro, Lee Berman, Lucas Slack, Macewinder54, Max Filipov, NWDD, Nate Graff, Patrick Romberg, Phoenix Thurakaz, Philby the Bilby, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Ray's Dad, Sheldon Hearn, Simon Jacobson, Steve Riley, Strateger in Ultima, The Forbidden Shrimp, Tyler Duncan, Whimsical Wisp, Wolf414, Zach Grendel, and Chow. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you around. Bye!